April 1945. A coal mine near Nordhausen, Germany. American combat engineers step through a blown wooden portal into the earth, their flashlights cutting through thick black air. The beams of light stop on a solid wall of rock and timber. The mine entrance is sealed from the outside, with freshly packed earth and heavy beams. The soldiers swing axes and heavy iron crowbars. The wood cracks. The dirt falls away. They do not find a hidden German bunker or a stockpile of artillery shells. They find bodies. Hundreds of thin, skeletal shapes are stacked against the damp stone walls 600 feet below the surface. The air is heavy with the smell of sulfur, toxic chemicals, and rot. This is a factory hidden from the sun, turned into a mass grave. General George S. Patton will make sure the men who sealed this tomb are forced to breathe its air. This is the story of what General Patton found 600 feet underground in a sealed mine full of slave laborers who never came up. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to our channel. We tell the World War, two stories that show the silence that screamed louder than any shell. Technical Sergeant James Clearwater was 30 years old, hailing from the rugged oil fields of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and serving with the 3rd Army Combat Engineers. Before the war, he spent his youth rigging oil derricks and working deep underground, a brutal trade that taught him how to read the subtle shifts of subterranean stone. He joined the military after his younger brother perished during the early maritime disasters in the Atlantic, leaving Clearwater with a quiet, hardened determination to see the conflict through to its absolute end. He had witnessed the worst of the European theater, from the mud of France to the shattered ruins of the Rhineland, but nothing prepared him for the darkness of the Thuringian hills. His knowledge of structural safety and toxic gas levels was the only reason the engineers noticed the freshly disturbed earth blocking the old coal portal. SS Untersturmführer Paul Richter was 29 years old, born to an affluent manufacturing family in Essen, Germany, and placed in absolute command of the subterranean labor detachment. He believed completely in the state doctrine that designated foreign prisoners as mere fuel for the war machine, openly stating that a worker's only value was the exact volume of steel components they produced before their hearts stopped. While his laborers wore rags and breathed a lethal mixture of sulfur and coal dust, Richter wore a custom-tailored wool uniform, kept his riding boots polished to a high mirror shine, and carried an engraved silver cigarette case given to him by a regional party official. He viewed his assignment not as a military post, but as a corporate production problem where human lives were counted as simple, replaceable overhead. His meticulous weekly logbooks showed that he tracked the mounting deaths under his watch, under the single, cold-column header labeled labor attrition. By April 1945, the European theater was a scene of total structural collapse. The German war machine was fracturing under the weight of a dual-front invasion, forcing its desperate leadership to move vital manufacturing operations deep beneath the earth. Allied bombers controlled the skies, raining fire down on traditional industrial centers like Essen and Berlin. In response, the German High Command utilized natural cave systems and existing coal shafts to hide their assembly lines from aerial observation. This desperate decentralization created hundreds of isolated fiefdoms across the Thuringian countryside, where local camp commanders operated entirely without central oversight or standard regulations. Military bureaucracy disintegrated into chaotic self-preservation, and the treatment of labor grew increasingly homicidal as the front line drew closer. Many frontline Allied officers focused entirely on maintaining the breakneck speed of the Western advance, frequently bypassed these secondary mining complexes to secure tactical crossroads. The rapid pace of the forward units meant that specialized engineering teams were left with the task of clearing out the pockets of territory bypassed by the tanks. In the confusion of the final weeks, retreating German units scrambled to destroy infrastructure, burn paperwork, and erase the physical evidence of their domestic programs. Wool factories were abandoned overnight, leaving thousands of captive workers locked away behind heavy timber bulkheads or buried alive beneath tons of intentionally detonated rock. It was a race against time between the advancing combat engineers and the destruction teams trying to sanitize the landscape. The American lines were pushing deep into the heart of Germany, uncovering hidden horrors at every turn as the old authorities fled into the forests. The advance guards finally reached the outskirts of Nordhausen, where the scent of burnt gunpowder mixed with the heavy stench of subterranean coal dust. An American captain from the division headquarters walked into the makeshift military office on the surface, holding a heavy leather notebook covered in coal dust. Paul Richter sat behind a heavy oak desk, slowly polishing his silver cigarette case with a clean handkerchief. The captain placed his muddy hands flat on the desk, looking directly at the German officer. "We found the excavation site down in the lower valley," the captain said. "Your engineers tried to dynamite the entry timber, but the charge failed to drop the main portal roof." Richter did not look up from his silver case. "That area is a restricted state industrial facility," he said. "You have no legal authorization to inspect the interior structure or interfere with our private manufacturing assets." The captain leaned forward, his voice tightening. "We didn't just look at the assets, Herr Richter. Our engineers broke through the timber seal and went down 600 feet into the main shaft. There are over 200 dead men stacked like cordwood against the rock walls. Most of them still have pickaxes and shovels gripped in their bare hands." "That is an entirely internal administrative matter," Richter answered, slowly placing the cigarette case into his breast pocket. "Those individuals were state property assigned to local ammunition production. Their physical disposal is covered by standard wartime labor regulations. Regulations do not include starving men to death in total darkness without an air ventilation system," the captain said. "Every man we brought up has severe chemical burns on his skin and lungs. The air down there is pure poison." "You do not understand the basic economics of the current defensive situation," Richter said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his polished boots. "The Reich requires fuse assemblies for the artillery forces. Human labor is simply a variable resource in the manufacturing schedule. When a unit of labor breaks, it is replaced by another unit. The output is all that matters to Berlin." "You lock them in," the captain said. "You packed the entrance with dirt and logs while they were still breathing down there. The advance of your armor threatened the security of our technological blueprints," Richter said. "The workforce could not be evacuated without violating regional security protocols. It was necessary to close the shaft to preserve our production secrets from foreign capture. It was a standard industrial procedure." The captain stared at the German officer for a long moment, his face turning pale in the dim room light. "This isn't a factory," he said. "This is a mass murder scene." Richter shrugged his shoulders slightly. "Your opinion is irrelevant under international military law," he said. "I am a university-trained administrator executing state economic orders. You cannot hold a corporate manager responsible for the standard attrition rates of a wartime factory shift." The captain straightened up and turned toward the door. "Secure this room," he told the guards outside. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top Jeep pulled up to the muddy entrance of the mine office, its tires throwing up dark grit against the side of the building. The 4 silver stars on his helmet caught the gray afternoon light, and the twin ivory-handled revolvers rested heavily on his hips. He stepped out of the vehicle without waiting for his drivers and walked straight past the guards. The entire room went silent as he entered. He did not slam the door, and he did not raise his voice. He walked to the center of the office and stopped, his eyes fixed on the German administrator. "Are you the officer responsible for the labor force in this sector?" Patton asked. "I am the chief administrative director of this industrial facility," Richter answered. "Did you sign the weekly logbooks tracking the manufacturing output?" Patton asked. "I certified all production and material logs for Berlin," Richter said. "Did you order the main entry timber to be blown with explosives today?" Patton asked. "I executed the standard security directive to protect our technological assets," Richter said. Patton studied the German for a long moment, his face completely rigid. You stand here with polished boots and a silver cigarette case, talking about industrial facilities and technological assets. You speak of standard directives as if you were running a department store in Berlin. But you did not run a department store. You ran a tomb with a production schedule. Your logs do not show assets, Herr Richter. They show human beings. You tracked their deaths under the column of labor attrition, matching the number of corpses directly against the number of fuse assemblies produced during the night shift. You calculated how long a man could breathe sulfur in the dark before his heart exploded. Sergeant Clearwater spent his youth in the oil fields, working under the earth, where men understand the true dangers of stone and gas. He knows what happens when a mine is left without ventilation. He knows what happens when men are forced to dig without light. He looked into your shaft and saw what you did to those 200 souls. You have a choice now. You will go down into that dark shaft yourself, without your tailored coat and without your polished boots. You will help the engineers carry every single body up to the surface, breathing the exact same air they breathed, or you will face a military firing squad before sunset. Decide now. Richter looked at the general, his mouth opening slightly as his hands began to tremble against his silver case. The military police moved Richter toward the open shaft within minutes of the confrontation. The German administrator stumbled on the rocky ground, his polished riding boots slipping in the mud as the guards stripped away his custom wool coat. He was forced down into the darkness of the 600-foot shaft alongside the combat engineers of the Third Army. The air below was thick with the suffocating stench of sulfur, damp coal dust, and stagnant rot. Richter began to choke almost immediately, his eyes burning from the chemical fumes that had filled the unventilated factory for 6 long months. Sergeant Clearwater stood at the top of the portal, organizing the recovery teams as they emerged from the darkness. Richter was forced to carry the first body up the wooden ladder, his hands shaking as he gripped the frozen, skeletal remains of a prisoner left against the rock wall. A crowd of local German civilians from Nordhausen had been gathered at the mine entrance by American military authorities. They stood in complete silence as the bodies were brought into the daylight, watching their former overseer labor under the weight of his own workforce. Richter sweated and gasped for clean air, his pristine uniform covered in the black soot of the tomb he had tried to bury. Sergeant Clearwater returned home to the oil fields of Tulsa, Oklahoma, late in the winter of 1945. He never took another job underground, choosing instead to work on the surface rigs where he could see the sky from dawn until dusk. He suffered from chronic respiratory issues for the rest of his life, a lasting consequence of the toxic air he inhaled during those frantic hours of recovery at Nordhausen. He lived quietly with his family, refusing to watch films about the war or read military histories, and died in 1982 at the age of 67. Paul Richter was captured by counterintelligence agents near Munich 3 weeks after the mine was liberated. His detailed logbooks, which tracked human life as a common manufacturing variable, were used as direct evidence during the subsequent war crimes trials at Nuremberg. He was convicted of crimes against humanity in 1947 and sentenced to life imprisonment in a federal penitentiary. He served 21 years of that term before being released due to failing health, returning to his family estate in Essen, where he lived in absolute isolation until his death in 1974. General Patton kept a certified carbon copy of Richter's final production report in his personal desk drawer until his own death in December 1945. He never recorded the incident in his official public memoirs, but he spoke of it once during a private dinner with his senior staff officers. He noted that the true horror of the modern industrial state was not its capacity for rage, but its ability to calculate the destruction of human life with a fountain pen and a ruler. Some historians have argued that Patton's immediate extrajudicial sentencing of local administrative personnel bypassed the established legal channels of the Western Alliance, potentially complicating subsequent systematic prosecutions at Nuremberg. They suggest that forcing non-military personnel into hazardous subterranean environments without formalized military tribunal oversight, bordered on a violation of standard operational protocol. Others have argued the opposite, maintaining that the extreme and immediate nature of the discovery required a decisive physical response to preserve the integrity of the scene and compel immediate compliance from the perpetrators. What is certain is that the detailed production logs recovered from the site provided irrefutable empirical proof of industrial murder that no defense team could dismantle. If you had been in General Patton's position, would you have executed the same swift, mirrored punishment at the mine entrance, or would you have delayed action to wait for a formal military tribunal? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more hidden World War II stories about the silence that screamed louder than any shell, make sure to subscribe.